May 1st, 1960. You were 13 miles above the surface of the Earth. Not 12, not 11. 13. Up here, the sky behind you is black, not blue, black. You can see the actual curve of the planet beneath you. You can see where the atmosphere ends and space begins, and it is closer than you ever imagined. Your name is Francis Gary Powers. You are 30 years old. You are flying the most secret aircraft ever built, 900 miles inside Soviet airspace, and you have been doing this for 4 hours and 27 minutes without incident. You think you are untouchable. Then you hear it. A sound like the world cracking open. The wings vanish, the sky tilts, and in the span of 3 seconds, the Cold War, which has been running at a low, controlled simmer for 15 years, is about to boil over. This is the story of the day the United States got caught in the biggest lie it ever told. And the man who fell out of the sky to prove it. To understand what happened on May 1st, 1960, you have to understand what Francis Gary Powers was flying. The U-2 is not a normal aircraft. It is not built for speed. It is not built for combat. It is built for one thing only: altitude. To fly so high that no missile, no fighter jet, and no earthly consequence can reach it. Kelly Johnson, the Lockheed engineer who designed it, called it the most difficult airplane in the world to fly. He was being conservative. At 70,000 feet, the air is so thin that the margin between flying and dying is roughly 6 knots wide. 6 knots, that is about 7 miles per hour. The speed difference between a brisk jog and a slow run. Pilots call it the Coffin Corner. Too slow. The wings lose lift and the aircraft drops like a javelin. Too fast. The shock waves build up and the airframe tears itself apart. 6 knots of sky between one death and another. You fly in between. For hours. Alone. In a pressure suit so rigid it takes ground crew 15 minutes to help you into it. Now, why is this plane here at all? Because in 1957, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik, and the men around Eisenhower began using a phrase that terrified him: nuclear Pearl Harbor. A first strike, ICBMs launched before anyone in Washington even knows they're coming. The United States would cease to exist between breakfast and lunch. Eisenhower had survived one Pearl Harbor. He was not going to preside over another. But to defend against a first strike, you have to know where the missiles are. And the Soviet Union is the largest country on the face of the earth, and it does not give tours. The CIA's answer is a camera called the HyCon-B, 9 feet long, 450 pounds. It carries enough film, a spool 65 pounds by itself, to photograph a strip of Earth 9 miles wide and 3,000 miles long in a single pass. At altitude, it can resolve an object 8 inches across from 13 miles up. A newspaper headline, a missile fin, a man's face. They bolted into the belly of the U-2 and call the program Aquatone. And for 4 years, it works perfectly. And here's the man they choose to fly it. Francis Gary Powers grew up in Bude, Virginia, a coal country town in the southwestern corner of the state. The kind of place where your options are the mine, the army, or leaving. His father was a cobbler. Powers chose leaving. He got a degree in physics from Milligan College, flew F-84 Thunderjets for the Air Force, and in 1956 was quietly approached by a recruiter from an organization that did not announce itself by name. The pay was $2,500 a month, about 4 times his Air Force salary. He said yes. He wanted to buy a house for his wife. That's it. That is the whole calculation. The man at the center of the worst intelligence disaster of the Cold War signed on for a house in Virginia. Inside the agency, pilots like Powers aren't called spies. They're called drivers. Their job is to sit in a cockpit barely wide enough for a human body, hold the aircraft in that 6-knot window for 7 hours at a stretch, and let the HyCon-B do the work. But they don't go entirely unarmed. Not exactly. Each driver carries a silver dollar. Modified. Inside the coin is a needle, coated in saxitoxin, a paralytic agent derived from shellfish. The agency's medical staff calculated the dose themselves. It kills within seconds of entering the bloodstream. It is not called a suicide device in the briefings. It is called an option. If you are taken, if interrogation is imminent, if you believe what is coming is worse than this, you press the needle against your skin. The choice is made, quickly. Powers carries it in his breast pocket, on every flight, for 4 years. He has never once considered using it. May 1st, 1960. 5:56 in the morning, local time. Peshawar Air Station, Pakistan. The mission is called Grand Slam. It is the most ambitious overflight ever attempted. Not a quick border crossing, not a partial pass, but a complete transit of the Soviet Union. Pakistan to Norway, 4,700 miles. Powers will fly over the Aral Sea, over Sverdlovsk, where the Soviets are believed to be producing their SS-6 ICBMs, over Chelyabinsk, over Kirov, across the full width of a country that covers 11 time zones. In Washington, Eisenhower has approved this flight with visible reluctance. The Paris summit is 16 days away, the first serious superpower peace talks in years. He has told his aides he wants the overflight stopped before then. Grand Slam is the last one. After this, they stop. He signs the authorization anyway. Powers climbs through 40,000 feet, 50, 60. The sky darkens above him as he rises out of the atmosphere. At 70,000 feet, he levels off and sets his course northeast. For the next 4 hours, the mission is textbook. The HyCon-B is running. The spool is turning. Below him, the Soviet military-industrial heartland scrolls past at 500 miles an hour, and none of it knows it is being photographed. He is a ghost. Except he is not a ghost. He never was. The Soviets have been tracking U-2 overflights since 1956. They plot every one. They file the coordinates. They watch the aircraft cross their territory and photograph their most sensitive installations. And they cannot do a thing about it. Because their MiG-19 interceptors top out at 55,000 feet. 15,000 feet below where Powers is flying. The Soviet Air Defense commander responsible for the Sverdlovsk region on May 1st is a general named Biryuzov. He has been embarrassed by these overflights for 4 years. He has scrambled jets that stalled and fell. He has fired missiles that detonated in empty air. He has written reports. He has been told the problem is being solved. Today, he has 14 SA-2 guideline missiles, radar-guided. Maximum effective ceiling, 72,000 feet. At 8:53 a.m. local time, the order is given. 14 SA-2s launch in sequence, leaving corkscrewing smoke trails that rise through thin air toward a target the crews cannot see with their eyes. What happens next is not a clean kill. The first missile detonates behind and below the U-2. Its proximity fuse catches a Soviet MiG-19 that has been scrambled as a visual spotter, killing its pilot, Sergei Safronov, who had no idea he was inside the missile's engagement envelope. His commanding officer will later say he was given no warning. He was not. A second SA-2 detonates close enough to Powers' aircraft to matter. Powers sees the flash in his rearview mirror first. Orange. Then the aircraft pitches up violently, past vertical, and the wings, those 70-foot wings, shear away. He is not in a plane anymore. He is in a seat, falling at 700 feet per second from 13 miles above the Ural Mountains. The ejection seat has explosive bolts that would sever his legs at this speed. He doesn't use it. He tries to reach the self-destruct switches instead. A red button and a green button that would detonate the camera charges and destroy the HyCon-B before the Soviets could recover it. He cannot reach them. The G-forces have him pressed flat against the instrument panel like a man being held underwater. He blows the canopy manually. The pressure differential sucks him half out before he can disconnect his oxygen hose. He is dragged through the opening, the hose still attached, the ground spinning 13 miles below. He disconnects. He falls free. The parachute deploys automatically at 15,000 feet. He has the silver dollar in his breast pocket. He does not use it. He lands in a field near the village of Koselino, east of Sverdlovsk, and a group of farmers are already walking toward him across the mud. He knows, in the way you know things when there is nothing left to calculate, that the KGB will be there within the hour. In Washington, the blip vanishes from the plotting board at 9:01 a.m. Moscow time. The CIA's working assumption, the assumption baked into every contingency plan for every U-2 mission, is that if an aircraft goes down, the pilot is dead. The self-destruct charges fire. There is no wreckage worth recovering, no pilot worth interrogating, no story worth telling. This assumption is wrong on every count. But they don't know that yet. So they activate the cover story. It has been sitting in a drawer at NASA for 2 years. On May 5th, NASA releases a statement about a missing weather research flight, officially designated NASA Flight 4052. The pilot, they say, was a civilian contractor employed to study atmospheric turbulence at high altitude. He may have blacked out from oxygen deprivation. The aircraft may have drifted off course from its base in Turkey. Lincoln White, the State Department spokesman, is asked directly, was this aircraft on an espionage mission? He says no, on the record, with conviction. NASA drags a U-2 out of storage, paints it with civilian markings, and rolls it in front of reporters as a visual aid. They show weather charts. They distribute technical diagrams of atmospheric research equipment. They look sincere because they have had 2 years to practice looking sincere. The world, for 4 days, believes them. The United States had just committed to a story they couldn't take back. But while Washington was busy managing the press, Nikita Khrushchev was preparing a trap that would change the course of the Cold War forever. If you want to see more deep dives into these hidden files and the high-stakes world of historical espionage, make sure you're subscribed to Night Shift Chronicles. Hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next investigation into the shadows of the 20th century, because as the Americans were about to find out, the Soviet Union wasn't just watching the skies. They were waiting for the right moment to speak. Nikita Khrushchev has been waiting 4 days to do this. He has the pilot, alive, cooperative, uninjured. He has the wreckage, enough of it to identify the aircraft and its purpose. He has the HyCon-B camera, largely intact, recovered from the crash site. He has 65 pounds of exposed film, already developed. He has, in short, the receipts. And he has let the United States spend 4 days writing checks against an account that is already empty. On May 7th, he goes to the microphone. He does not lead with the pilot. He leads with the American statement. He reads Lincoln White's denial back to the Supreme Soviet, word for word, with the air of a man reading a joke whose punchline the audience hasn't heard yet. Then he delivers it. The pilot is alive. The camera is intact. The film has been developed. Soviet technicians have been examining the photographs for 4 days. The images show Soviet airfields, missile sites, military installations, all of it photographed at high resolution by an aircraft that the United States government has just publicly claimed was measuring weather patterns over Turkey. The American response over the following 48 hours is one of the more extraordinary spectacles in diplomatic history. The State Department admits the intelligence mission, but implies it wasn't authorized at the presidential level. The White House then contradicts this, confirming Eisenhower personally approved it. The State Department issues a correction. The White House issues a correction to the correction. Eisenhower eventually does something no sitting president had ever done. He stands in front of the press and confirms, on the record, that he ordered the operation. He accepts personal responsibility. It is a moment of real integrity inside a story that doesn't have many of them. It changes nothing. At the Paris summit,
Khrushchev arrives with 3 demands: a formal American apology, a permanent halt to overflights, and punishment of the officials responsible. Eisenhower has already grounded the U-2s. He will not apologize. Khrushchev withdraws. He cancels Eisenhower's planned visit to Moscow. He suspends the entire negotiating framework that the 2 countries have been building for 2 years. 2 weeks later, a Soviet court sentences Francis Gary Powers to 10 years. The trial lasts 3 days. It is not a trial in any functional sense. The verdict was decided before the first witness was called. What it is, what Khrushchev intends it to be, is a demonstration, a live broadcast to the world, with the American pilot as the primary exhibit. Powers understands this. He does not fight it. He answers questions directly, admits what he cannot credibly deny, and declines to volunteer anything beyond what's asked. He testifies that he was following orders. He says he regrets the incident. His Soviet defense attorney, appointed by the state, not chosen by Powers, delivers a closing argument requesting leniency on grounds that Powers is merely a tool of American imperialism, not its architect. The court sentences him to 3 years imprisonment, to be followed by 7 years of hard labor.
Lubyanka prison sits on the square that bears its name, 7 minutes from the Kremlin. For a century, it has been the address most feared in the Soviet Union. The KGB's headquarters and detention center, one building. The Soviets treat Powers with calculated decency. They give him books, a small television, adequate food. They are not torturing him. They are managing him, keeping him cooperative, keeping him stable, keeping him from becoming a problem. He will later write that he thought about the silver dollar constantly in those months, not with regret that he hadn't used it, with something harder to name. The fact that the option existed, that someone had designed a coin that could kill him, calculated the dose, and put it in his pocket before he ever climbed into the cockpit, told him everything about what the agency had thought his odds were from the beginning. While Powers sits in Lubyanka, a man named Emil Goldfuss is sitting in the federal penitentiary in Atlanta. Emil Goldfuss is not his real name. His real name is Rudolf Ivanovich Abel, and he is a colonel in the KGB who spent 9 years living in Brooklyn under commercial cover. A photographer, an amateur painter, pleasant to his neighbors, unknown to his neighbors. He ran a Soviet intelligence network across the northeastern United States. He was arrested in 1957, tried for espionage, and convicted. His defense attorney was a Wall Street lawyer named James Donovan, who argued at sentencing that Abel should not receive the death penalty, not because he was innocent, but because a living Soviet intelligence officer might one day be worth something in an exchange. The judge sentenced Abel to 30 years instead of death. Donovan was right. It took 4 years, but he was right. In the winter of 1961, Donovan is back, not as Abel's attorney this time, but as a back-channel negotiator. His counterparts are East German intermediaries working on behalf of the Soviets. His objective is a 2-for-1. Powers and an American economics student named Frederick Pryor, arrested in East Berlin on unrelated charges, in exchange for Abel. The Soviets agree. The details take months. February 10th, 1962, 6:15 in the morning, 22 degrees Fahrenheit. You are standing at the West German end of the Glienicke Bridge over the Havel River, a long, flat span connecting West Berlin to Potsdam, its midpoint the legal boundary between East and West. Fog on the water. You are standing at the West German end of the Glienicke Bridge, watching. Berlin, February. The gray that Berlin does better than anywhere. Pre-dawn. 2 groups are assembled at opposite ends. Americans at the west, Soviets at the east. The fog sits on the Havel in layers. You can see perhaps 30 meters of bridge before it disappears into gray. On a signal, 2 men begin to walk toward each other. Abel from the east, Powers from the west. They move at the pace of men who have learned not to rush things. They do not make eye contact. They do not speak. The protocol, agreed in advance, stipulates silence.
They pass at the midpoint without breaking stride. Francis Gary Powers steps onto West German soil at 6:22 a.m. He has been gone 637 days. There are no parades. Powers is taken immediately to a debriefing facility. The sessions are professional and exhaustive, and the tone underneath them never quite warms up. Why didn't you use the saxitoxin needle? Why didn't you reach the self-destruct switches? What did you tell them? What did you volunteer? He answers everything. A review board convened by CIA Director John McCone eventually concludes that Powers conducted himself with courage and followed his orders properly throughout. The board's findings are classified. In March, Powers is called before the Senate Armed Services Committee. The hearing is public. Senator Richard Russell wants to know why he didn't destroy the aircraft. Senator Leverett Saltonstall asks about the poison pin. The implication hanging over the room, present the way smoke is present, never named, is that a braver man might have made different choices at 70,000 feet. Powers explains again that he could not reach the self-destruct switches, that he did not use the needle because he was not being tortured, and using it preemptively would have been, his word, murder. The senators nod and ask the same questions in slightly different order. He is not charged with anything. He is simply made to feel, in the institutional way that organizations have perfected, that he has failed a test he was never told he was taking. The CIA does not renew his contract. He writes a memoir, Operation Overflight, published in 1970. He is careful in it, measured, factual, and it is devastating anyway, because the facts are sufficiently strange on their own. He flies traffic reports for KNBC radio in Los Angeles, monitoring the 5 o'clock gridlock from a helicopter. If this seems like a long way from the edge of space, it is, and he knows it. On August 1st, 1977, Powers is flying a Bell 206 for KNBC when the aircraft runs low on fuel near Van Nuys Airport. He auto-rotates toward an open field, a procedure he has practiced hundreds of times. He clips a tree on the approach and the helicopter goes in hard. He's 47 years old. The investigation finds the fuel gauge had been malfunctioning. The aircraft's maintenance logs were inadequate. He survived 13 miles up. He survived an SA-2 detonating 30 feet from his aircraft. He survived Lubyanka and the Senate Armed Services Committee and being the most famous national embarrassment of 1960. He did not survive a broken fuel gauge over the San Fernando Valley. It takes 52 years. In 2012, the United States Air Force posthumously awards Francis Gary Powers the Silver Star. The citation states that he demonstrated exceptional loyalty and performed his duties in a professional manner throughout his capture, trial, and imprisonment. 52 years. His grandson accepts the medal. Powers Jr. has spent decades running a Cold War museum in Virginia, a place built in part to tell this story accurately. Not the story of the man who got caught. The story of the man who sat in a cell in Moscow for 21 months and gave them nothing they didn't already have. Francis Gary Powers was not a movie hero. He had no clever escape. He did not die dramatically. He lived, which is the thing the agency had not fully planned for, and then had to keep living in a country that didn't know what to do with a man like that. He flew 27 missions over the most hostile airspace on Earth without incident. On the 28th, he was shot down by a weapon specifically engineered to reach him. He did everything right. It didn't matter. Because in the Cold War, as in most wars, doing everything right was not always the variable that determined the outcome. He flew the mission. He survived the fall. He endured the silence. And history, which moves slowly and does not apologize, eventually corrected the record. The U-2 program flew reconnaissance missions over the Soviet Union from 1956 to 1960. In that time, it returned more usable intelligence on Soviet military capabilities than all previous collection operations combined. Francis Gary Powers flew 27 of those missions. He came home from the 28th. He asked for nothing unusual in return, just a house,